Welcome back to Monday's edition of FreightWaves Now. It's time to catch up with Tyler Cole, our Director of Carbon Intelligence here at FreightWaves and one of the co-hosts of our Net Zero Carbon podcast. Tyler, thanks for joining us today.
Happy Monday. Good morning.
Great to have you as always. And we've got to thank Convoy, of course, for the sponsor of this segment and for all the work that they do for net zero carbon as a whole. And today we're talking a little bit about their presence at the Mid-America Trucking Show that's going on this week. They've got a pretty big footprint there. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's one of the bigger truck shows of the year. It's going on in Louisville, Kentucky later this week. And one thing I think is interesting and good about Convoy is they spend a lot of effort to engage and empower owner operators. So there are a lot of tools being deployed for that specific driver population. And there's lots of benefits that come with that, not only from Convoy's green programs, allowing them to forward book loads and try to reduce empty miles, but there's just tools that help them manage their business better, from green delivery windows and things that Convoy's rolled out, like in an app for them to be able to use more efficiently. So yeah, they'll have a big presence at the show. I would encourage anybody who's interested in their tools to go check them out.
Awesome, Tyler. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, the host of our Net Zero Carbon show here at FreightWaves. Can you get us caught up on some of the latest episodes that just aired?
Definitely. Last Friday, we had Peter Bolstorff from the American Supply Chain, ASCM. He's been a VP over there for almost 20 years. He's really written the book on excellence in supply chain. You should check it out. We talked about all things circularity and how sustainability is now table stakes, specifically for manufacturers and shippers, when they start planning strategy moving ahead. It's not something that you can take lightly, and it's where CEOs and people are having a lot of attention and investing on how their businesses adapt to the new business climate, not only in an adapting global climate as we're dealing with the impact of climate change, but if you don't know where you need to be investing your dollars and your resources, and also, and this is a big thing that ASCM does a great job of, training your employees on how to think about these risks, you're not paying attention to the climate around us. We do have some great episodes coming up for the rest of the month. We've got Andrea Pope from Leaf Logistics coming on later this Friday, actually, to talk about their digital marketplace. And then we've got a couple carriers coming on, which I'm excited about. And you have to just tune in to check and see who that is.
I think that's really an interesting point to talk about sustainability being table stakes from the top of the supply chain down, and you need that to build in the circularity, because I think oftentimes we put a lot of the onus and responsibility on the carriers, right? Get into this technology to reduce your empty miles, invest in these electric vehicles, and now reduce your emissions through this add-on to your truck. But a lot of it comes from that shipper mindset and changing the mindset of, okay, I can change this order now to go on one truck instead of splitting it out between 6 shipments, and I can now use this less energy in producing this product so that therefore it's closer to net zero when it goes out my doors, right? Can you talk a little bit about how that mindset change is something that needs to be adopted kind of in the shipper industry, and we need to stop putting all the responsibility on the carrier?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that the carrier has limited options. If you want them to move your load, diesel's how they're going to use the truck. That's how they're going to power the truck to move down the road. And depending on how good they are at their job, reducing their miles and improving their cost structure at the carrier level, you may not get any benefits if you're a shipper looking to reduce emissions. So it's true that if we're pursuing this new way of doing business, it's going to require new tools and data and information to drive those changes. And specifically, when you're making material, either CapEx or operating changes in your business, it's going to require you demonstrating value to your superiors and to the owners of the company in order to get buy-in to make those changes, right? So we think about, the tailpipe as the ultimate source of emissions in freight and logistics, and the shipper has very little control over that. At the end of the day, what they do have control over is how do we minimize idling at my warehouses when drivers are loading. And there's operational benefits that come from getting product in and out the door faster. And not only, the social benefits of not having drivers sitting there waiting for hours, unable to eat or go to the bathroom. Right? It's a very broad umbrella of sustainability that we're trying to tackle. And the narrow focus on just tailpipe emissions really does a disservice to the broader landscape of change we're trying to usher in. So I really liked talking to Peter to dive into how shippers are thinking about de-risking their facilities and their businesses in an environment where there's potentially more government regulation that's coming after you from disclosure, but also to reductions, as well as, potential costs of insurance changes if you've got coastal facilities, right, that might be subject to sea level rise or things of that nature, more volatile weather events. There's so much to think about, and we need new tools and new data to be able to inform decision making moving forward. And drivers are important, and we can't get away from that. And Convoy, I think, does a great job. In fact, they just released their Q1 sustainability report where they poll, I think, 700 carriers, everybody from owner operators all the way to larger trucking firms, and ask them, what are you excited about driving? What concerns you most about lowering your emissions? Is it operational cost savings? Is it pressures from customers? Is it because you see actual change in your home environment and your community? And they do a good job of exploring that. And there were some really interesting pieces there.
Yeah, Tyler, I was just about to ask you about that report. Can you dive into some of those interesting pieces that really kind of stood out to you throughout this report?
Definitely. It was interesting because they do this quarterly. So you see in-track changes over time. So they do have their sample population has not changed terribly much. It's still heavily weighted towards the average driver. It's 45 to 55, a Gen Xer, truly. Most of them have been driving longer than 5 years, but there's a good percentage of new, younger drivers in their sample size. And you see a very stark divide, and have in previous reports as well, between what the younger generation thinks and believes about how important climate change is and how we need to reduce emissions versus people who have been in the industry much longer. And you see that same difference in older drivers who've been, not older drivers, but experienced drivers who have been in the seat for 5+ years are less excited about driving a newer electric or hydrogen vehicle than the younger generation is. So it's really interesting to see the disparity in those two groups. Another interesting thing that came out of this month's report was an increase in the pressure on drivers, or the perceived pressure from government regulations lowering emissions. And you might ask, what's driving that one? I think you could specifically point to the Biden administration coming out and starting to set heavy-duty truck emission standards in line with what they've done in the passenger fleet. That's something that we haven't seen in a long time, and I think that's going to have a potential big impact on reducing emissions. OEMs are watching it, drivers are watching it, drivers are concerned, and you'll see that in this report, about the incremental cost from these new technologies that are going on the rigs that are going to have to lower emissions. It's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out.
I think a lot of that pressure also comes not only from the federal level with the Biden administration, but also from the state level, right? Thinking of the rules that the California Air Resources Board are putting into place that are really kind of harsh when it comes to those model year 2010 or newer trucks being required by 2023. And that puts a ton of pressure on carriers to, one, upgrade their fleets, but also on those owner operators who maybe got into the industry in a little bit of an older vehicle. They can't really afford to upgrade that, especially right now in the current climate. Can you talk a little bit about those costs, and if there's any type of program out there, or sustainability program, maybe grant program, rolled into helping these drivers who might need assistance when it comes to upgrades?
I'm glad you mentioned that last piece, because that's the big carrot when you're implementing a new program like that, where you're going to say, hey, here's our line in the sand. You can't bring this truck in this port anymore if it's not meeting this new criteria. The carrot they dangle for that is incentive. So you've got grant subsidies at either point of purchase or ongoing cost of operation, depending on if it's a diesel powered fuel or like a zero emission fuel that's maybe a port dray truck or something of that nature. But yeah, it's a big consideration. You've got a lot of older equipment that have historically operated in and out of the ports. That's why you see the air quality in a lot of those parts of the country that are not great. And those local communities, specifically in more progressive states like California, have really just put their foot down and said, hey, we're going to make this change for the benefit of everyone that lives in and around this community. And it is more expensive when you retire an aging truck that's got older technology, that's been, a million miles truck. It's going to be more expensive when you get into a new one. And that's just the fact of doing business. But as long as everyone knows the rules of the game and it's fair and everyone has access to the same equipment, so we don't have larger fleets that are getting in first and edging out the smaller guys for those grant monies, right? Because it's a limited pool of funds in many cases. As long as we can stick to those kind of a fair playing field for everybody, it's going to go the right direction, specifically as it relates to impacting climate. And you see a lot of other benefits as you get drivers in new equipment. I mean, there's a lot of things to like about being in a newer truck, right? From just the features and the technology that's available for these drivers in a new truck. I think there's a lot of uplift, but you will see, to answer your original question, a lot of incremental costs coming as we try to make these new technology changes and implement them first in places along the West Coast. And then you've got the Northeast that's putting in a lot of these same zero emission truck requirements at a certain date in the future. The trick is going to be balancing it with the cost we have available to get those trucks on the road to the right people and not, cut our nose off to spite our face. Not everybody's going to be in an EV in 5 years. We don't have the ability to produce them. We don't have the financing to be able to get them in everybody's hands. I mean, we probably don't have a grid that could support it, honestly, at scale today. So these are going to be incremental changes that happen percentages at a time. And all of a sudden, it's going to not feel slow anymore. It's going to be fast because everybody's going to see, oh, that's a pretty sexy little Tesla EV pulling in and out of the port. I think I'd rather have one of those, right?
So Ty, I think you bring up a great point, and really the rollout of, getting alternative fuels, EVs, things like that, when you're looking at the infrastructure and things that are needed. When you tie in current events, and you saw, of course, some of the spike ups in oil and diesel and paying more at the pump, does this kind of event really kind of push forward some of this sustainability that we're seeing kind of really spur up in a meaningful way in the supply chain? Or do you see that it maybe helps some individuals that might be on the fence on, okay, I'm all about this because I don't really want this to be an impact later on down the line?
Great question. Everybody's asking it. What's the impact of this current geopolitical conflict, and how's it going to either accelerate or decelerate a clean energy transition, right? In the short term, I think it's very possible that in a race to resiliency, as people are looking to de-risk, lock in, right? So you think about the EU right now, they've been locked into Russian gas. They've been slowly phasing out nuclear for the last few decades. Now, in the short term, to get away from that, they're going to have to burn coal and they're going to have to reinvest in nuclear. It's just, there's no other option other than being, tied to a dictator at the end of the day. So play that down to the micro level and look more domestically. People are not going to rush out and, especially in an inflationary environment, overly spend and reduce their margin to implement clean energy technologies unless there's an incentive, whether I'm capturing market share, whether I'm giving my customers what they want, so now I can charge them more because they're trying to meet their own goals, or we've got some policy that's making everybody do it, right? I do think you're going to see acceleration, by and large, come out of this current climate that we're living through. I think you're going to see people follow through on the investments that they've said they've made, whether it's Ford building battery plants here in Tennessee, whether that's, I just saw DHL signed an agreement to buy, millions of gallons of sustainable jet fuel from Air BP. Those guys have to live up to those announcements over the next 3 to 5 years. And I think after we get out of this short-term time horizon where everybody's feeling the inflationary crunch and energy is tight and ag is tight, and trucking and transportation prices are high. Once we get on the other side of this thing, I think we will continue to see that up and to the right trend of renewables being introduced.
Gotta walk the walk. Thank you, Tyler. As always, great to have you. We'll catch you Friday for the next episode of Net Zero Carbon, and have a great week.
Y'all too. Thanks.
Right now, we're going to take one last quick break. We'll be back to wrap up our show in just a few minutes.